What happened when an undercover CEO stepped into his struggling cafe and discovered one loyal manager being quietly sabotaged? You're about to find out. Welcome back, dear listeners, smart, thoughtful folks who know that real stories still matter. Today's tale is for those who believe character counts more than corner offices, and that doing the right thing never goes out of style. This story isn't just about coffee, it's about loyalty, betrayal, and redemption. So pour yourself a warm cup, sit back, and get ready for a journey where justice is served with a shot of cream. The morning fog rolled off Baltimore's harbor like a gray tide, wrapping the streets in silence. Elliot Ramsey stepped off the city bus and stood still for a moment, watching the gulls circle overhead. He hadn't been back to this block in over a decade. Not since Harbor Roast Cafe 42 had been honored as one of the top 10 small coffee shops in the country. It looks different now. The signage was cracked, one of the neon letters dim, and the bright red awning he'd once approved in a flurry of optimism had faded to a dusty rose. He pulled his hood tighter and stepped inside, careful not to draw attention. Behind the counter stood a man with tired eyes and proud shoulders. Marco Diaz. The name was stitched across his apron, same as it had been 17 years ago when Elliot first hired him during Harbor Roast's second expansion wave. But Marco didn't recognize him. That was the point. The station had built Harbor Roast from a weathered pierside shack into a national brand of over 200 cafes, then stepped back 5 years ago to let professional operators scale it further. Now he was just a traveler with a fake name, Ellie Rains, a man nursing a vague story about passing through town and looking for work. He ordered a simple black coffee, watching Marco move with practiced grace behind the bar, tamping espresso and steaming milk as if he were conducting a quiet orchestra. The cafe felt like a ship with patched sails, worn but still upright. Customers trickled in and out, a pair of dock workers, a young woman in scrubs, an older man reading a paperback. Life still moves here, but Elliot felt something was off beneath the surface. The moment his coffee was placed in front of him, he took his first sip and nodded politely. Strong, good roast. Marco gave a short smile. It's the same blend we've used since the beginning. Not much changes here. Elliot glanced around. Some of the furniture was chipped, a shelf near the register sagged slightly, and the cafe playlist cut in and out over a weak speaker. He recognized it all. This place had his fingerprint, but the margins told a different story. Strong traffic, flat revenue, rising expenses. Something didn't add up. No red flags on paper, just a steady bleed. That's why he was here, because numbers didn't lie, but sometimes people made sure no one looked closely enough to see what was being stolen in plain sight. And if someone was bleeding Harbor Roast dry, they'd picked the wrong cafe to start with. Because this cafe wasn't just another line item in a quarterly report, it was sacred ground, and Elliot Ramsey had come home to protect it. The next morning, Elliot returned early, slipping through the cafe's side entrance before sunrise. He found Marco already inside, sleeves rolled up, fighting with the espresso machine's temperamental steam wand. Gave up whining and decided to spit out water this morning, Marco muttered, half to himself. Elliot offered a quiet nod and rolled up his sleeves. Mind if I take a look? Marco hesitated, then shrugged. Be my guest. It's been acting up since Thanksgiving. Elliot crouched beside the machine and ran a practiced eye over the tubing and valves. Old, but functional. After a few minutes and a paperclip from the register drawer, the hiss softened to a steady purr. Marco raised his eyebrows. Not bad for a traveler, he said, offering a cautious smile. Elliot just sipped the coffee Marco handed him and nodded toward the cafe floor. Is place matter to you? Marco chuckled. More than it should. I've spent half my adult life behind that counter. Over the next hour, Elliot watched Marco move between tasks, checking inventory, prepping pastries, politely answering a customer's question about oat milk. It was the quiet kind of excellence no spreadsheet could ever measure. When the morning rush hit, Elliot stepped in to help without asking. He wiped counters, restocked cups, and earned a nod of approval from a college student behind the bar. By noon, Marco leaned against the back wall and said, "You're not bad in a crunch. Ever think about working here longer?" Elliot smiled. Maybe. Depends on the coffee. Marco laughed, the sound rough around the edges. You'll get used to the burn. But behind the light-heartedness, Elliot sensed fatigue, a weight that came not just from long hours, but from carrying something heavier. Later that afternoon, Marco confided that maintenance requests had been piling up for months with no reply from corporate. We keep getting auto-replies and we'll look into it emails, he said, nodding toward the sagging shelf. I fixed that with my own tools. I don't even ask anymore. Elliot made mental notes of everything: broken speakers, warped tabletops, outdated signage. On paper, these would look like minor oversights, but up close, they were signs of neglect. And something about the way Marco kept checking the delivery logs and frowning told Elliot it wasn't just poor management. It was a quiet alarm. Something deeper was happening, and Marco knew more than he was letting on. Elliot had seen this kind of weariness before, in soldiers, in whistleblowers, in people too loyal to walk away, and he knew it always meant the same thing. Someone was hiding something, and someone else was paying the price. It was late Wednesday morning when the shipment arrived. A tall delivery man with earbuds dangling stepped into the café, wheeling in a stack of boxes taller than himself. "Delivery for Harbor Roast 42, he mumbled, already sliding an invoice across the counter for Marco's signature. Marco flipped through the manifest, his brow tightening. 6 cases of premium espresso roast? That's double our usual. This isn't right, he muttered. The delivery man shrugged. Not my job to question. Just sign and move on. Marco reluctantly scribbled his name and turned to Elliot with a quiet, "Mind giving me a hand with these?" They wheeled the boxes into the narrow back storage room where cardboard towers leaned awkwardly between mismatched shelving and leftover holiday decorations from a year ago. Elliot waited until they were alone, then asked, "You didn't order this?" Marco shook his head. "Nope. Last week we got extra mocha syrup, the week before it was 6 dozen reusable mugs. We didn't need any of it." He pointed to a half-used pallet of those same mugs collecting dust in the corner. "But every time, the system says we did." Elliot crouched beside one of the newly delivered boxes, inspecting the label, Portview Logistics, vendor ID 8776. The name sparked something in his memory. Portview. Wasn't that a facilities vendor added post-acquisition? He quietly snapped a photo of the invoice and scanned the line items. The prices were bloated, absurd even. $28.00 per pound of beans that usually cost half that. "You report this?" Elliot asked. Marco gave a tired laugh. "First 2 times, yeah. After that I stopped. Either no one responded, or I got some canned reply saying, 'All invoices reflect current contract terms.'" He rubbed his temples and added, "I've been logging the overages myself. Thought maybe I was going crazy." Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he moved to the small wall cabinet labeled Vendor Files and peeked inside. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Duplicate maintenance bills for the same appliance, marked urgent but never fulfilled. Line items for consulting services with vague descriptions like Menu Optimization Review and Q3 Regional Insights, all billed through Portview. One paper even bore a faded signature from someone Elliot had never authorized. "Marco, have you ever met anyone from this company in person?" Marco shook his head. "Not once. Just emails. Generic names, rotating reps, no faces." Elliot stood slowly, piecing together the threads. Someone had embedded themselves in Harbor Roast's back end, quietly, methodically siphoning money. And they were doing it with just enough subtlety to avoid alarms. But what chilled him most wasn't the theft. It was how easily it could go unnoticed. Good people like Marco were too busy holding the line to question every paper trail. Elliot had seen it before. The perfect scam hides inside the routine. And now he was sure. This café wasn't just a victim. It was ground zero. The café had long since closed, but the scent of brewed coffee and baked goods still lingered in the air like a memory refusing to fade. Outside, the harbor lamps cast soft golden halos on the wet cobblestones. Inside, the only light came from the glow above the espresso bar, where Elliot and Marco sat on upturned milk rates, sharing a pot of dark roast, too bitter for customers, but perfect for clearing a tired mind. They hadn't spoken much since the delivery incident, but the silence between them was comfortable, like 2 soldiers recovering from the same quiet war. Marco finally broke it, his voice low and uncertain. Do you ever get the feeling someone's watching this place? Like, more than just bad accounting? Elliot nodded slowly, waiting. Marco reached under the bar and pulled out a wrinkled, white envelope. This came a few months ago. No return address. Just this. He slid it across the counter. Inside was a small card printed in cold black letters. Stop making waves, or your son's future sinks with this ship. Elliot felt a knot tighten in his chest. Jesus, he murmured, more to himself than to Marco. You report this? Marco gave a bitter laugh. To who? HR? I tried. Got a call back 2 days later saying I'd been randomly selected for a performance review. Week after that, my son's tuition payment got bounced from my account, even though I'd already paid it. He rubbed his eyes, the weight of months, maybe years, pressing down. I thought maybe I made a mistake, but then it happened again. Then the late shipments, then the wrong invoices, and every time I tried to follow up, something else would go wrong. The register locks up, the security cameras glitch. It's like the place is cursed. Elliot leaned forward, careful with his words. It's not cursed. It's targeted. And you're not crazy. Marco looked up at him sharply. Then why am I the only one who seems to care? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a plea. Elliot didn't answer right away. He sipped the coffee, let the bitterness settle on his tongue, and said finally, You're not. And you're not alone anymore. Marco studied him, skeptical. But something in Elliot's voice rang differently this time. Not like a drifter making conversation, but a man who knew what it was to be betrayed by his own creation. That night, when Marco left through the back door, Elliot stayed behind, surrounded by unpaid invoices and unanswered maintenance requests. He pulled out his laptop, opened a private spreadsheet, and began mapping connections. Vendor codes, shipping routes, duplicate charges. By midnight, the patterns were undeniable, and all of them pointed back to the same name, Portview. 2 days later, Elliot sat beneath a patio heater on the rooftop of the Whitestone Hotel, dressed in an elegant navy blazer, silver cufflinks, and the sharp persona of Logan Kane, a private equity investor sniffing out logistics disruption opportunities in the food service sector. The night air was brisk but clear, and the city sparkled below like a promise. He swirled his drink without tasting it, watching the elevator doors as they opened with a chime. First came Nina Wexler, young, polished, and confident, the self-proclaimed vice president of business development for Portview Solutions. She greeted him warmly, her smile practiced but not unkind. Mr. Kane, she said, extending her hand. Mr. Stone will join us shortly. Elliot nodded, playing the role. Looking forward to it? 15 minutes of polite small talk passed before the elevator opened again, and there he was, Calvin Stone. The years had sculpted Calvin's features into something colder, tighter, more precise. His once unruly curls were trimmed into a perfect salt and pepper fade, his jaw clean-shaven, his gait more cautious but still deliberate. If he recognized Elliot, he didn't show it. Logan Kane, Calvin said smoothly, shaking his hand. Pleasure. Nina tells me you're interested in our model. Deeply, Elliot replied, forcing a smile. You've built something. Efficient. They sat across from one another beneath the patio lights, and for a while the conversation danced around buzzwords. Integrated services, vendor streamlining, cost optimization. But when Elliot mentioned Harbor Roast by name, a flicker crossed Calvin's face. That old relic, he said, chuckling. Didn't know they still used actual beans. I figured they were pumping in brown water by now. Elliot kept his voice even. You've been involved with them a while now, yes? Calvin's eyes glinted. Let's just say we've found ways to extract value from legacy systems. Places like that bleed slowly, so slowly no one notices. He leaned in, lowering his voice. That brand was always too sentimental, too loyal to the past. Loyalty, he added, swirling his whiskey, is a liability in business. Elliot forced a laugh, though his hands trembled under the table. The man across from him was no longer the friend he'd once shared dreams and ramen with in their startup days. This was a strategist with a grudge, someone who knew exactly how to gut a brand without ever leaving fingerprints. You seem to have taken this one personally, Elliot offered. Why harbor roast? Calvin's smile faded for just a second, because some things are worth burning down slowly. When they parted that night, Elliot didn't look back. He walked 3 blocks to the harbor and stared out at the dark water. What had once been a dream between 2 idealists had become a battlefield, and Elliot finally realized this wasn't just about business. It was about ghosts. One of them had just shaken his hand. Next morning, Elliot arrived at Café 42 before dawn, the harbor still cloaked in mist and silence. Inside, Marco stood by the back counter, sleeves rolled up, the same apron dusted with flour. He glanced up with a guarded smile. "Early bird again?" Elliot hesitated, then walked in with a different posture. Not the relaxed drifter, but a man preparing for something heavier. "We need to talk," he said. Marco looked up, instantly alert. "Something wrong?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside, he revealed an ID badge with a photo that looked like a younger version of himself, clean-cut, confident, and unmistakably real. Elliot Ramsey, founder and chairman, Harbor Roast, Inc. Marco stared at it, then at him. "You're joking." Elliot shook his head. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I had to see it for myself. What was really happening here, unfiltered, before someone cleans up the truth." Marco backed up a step, his face flushing with betrayal. "So all this time, the questions, the repairs, the coffee talk, that was you spying?" "No," Elliot said gently. "It was me trying to remember what this place used to be, and trying to figure out how I let it become this." Marco crossed his arms. "And what happens now? You file a report? Shut us down for not meeting metrics?" Elliot shook his head. "No one's getting shut down, but someone is getting exposed." As if on cue, Marco's phone buzzed. He read the message and swore under his breath. "Corporate just flagged this store for a surprise audit this afternoon. I've seen it before. It's the pretext they use before closing shops quietly. Non-compliance, they call it. One too many broken fixtures and suddenly we're a liability." He looked up. "Is this you?" "No," Elliot said, his jaw tight. "This is Calvin? He's trying to speed things up after that meeting." Marco didn't speak, but the flicker of panic in his eyes said enough. "He's not just bleeding the brand," Elliot added. "He's targeting you." Then Marco's phone buzzed again. He read the message in silence, then slowly sat down on the edge of the prep table. "The university reversed my son's tuition payment, said it bounced. I wired it 2 weeks ago." His voice was thin now, defeated. "That was everything I had left." Elliot didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his checkbook, an old habit he hadn't used in years, and began writing. "This is temporary," he said, handing Marco a check for $5,000, 0 cents. "But your son is staying in school, no matter what." Marco looked at the check like it was a lifeline thrown to a man drowning. "Why are you doing this?" Elliot met his eyes. "Because I forgot who I was, and I won't let someone else pay for that." By noon, Elliot stood in the gleaming boardroom at Harbor Roast headquarters, high above the bustle of downtown. Gone was the barista's flannel and faded jeans. He wore the tailored charcoal gray suit that once defined him, but something had changed in the set of his shoulders. The room was full. Senior counsel, internal auditors, IT forensics, and 2 board members already whispering about the quiet storm brewing in the press. Elliot cleared his throat. "This won't be a typical emergency meeting," he began, "because this isn't just about a vendor issue. It's about a rot that started in our foundation and was allowed to spread under the guise of efficiency." He clicked to a slide. "Portview Solutions, vendor contracts, 18 active locations. This company's bleeding us dry through inflated invoices, fake consulting fees, and falsified maintenance charges. They've built a shell network, and we handed them the keys." As the room stirred, he continued, "I'd spent the last week at Café 42 undercover, watching it firsthand. I watched a manager with 17 years of loyalty be pushed toward ruin. I watched his son's tuition get reversed as punishment for asking too many questions. And I watched it all happen while we sat here, blind." A stunned silence followed. No one moved. Then a voice from the legal team asked, "What do you suggest we do?" Elliot tapped the remote again. "We give Calvin Stone what he wants, a meeting, a buyout offer. He thinks we're still on our heels." He turned to his general counsel. "Can we legally record it?" "Yes," she said, "with full consent from our side." Within 24 hours, a false identity had been created. Logan Kane, a venture capitalist eager to buy into Portview's logistics empire. The meeting was set at headquarters in a private lounge wired with discreet surveillance equipment. Elliot would be wearing a watch fitted with a high-fidelity mic, feeding directly to a secure hard drive. But the trap wasn't just digital, it was emotional. Because Elliot knew Calvin wouldn't resist the chance to gloat, to stand in the very building he once helped build and mock its decay. While the team prepared for the sting, Elliot returned to Café 42. Marco met him outside, anxiety in his eyes. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Elliot nodded. "It has to." He paused, then added, "No one else is coming to save this place. We're it." That night, they reviewed every suspicious invoice, printed backups, cross-checked delivery logs, and photographed storage rooms. By the time the sun came up, they had built a bulletproof tunnel. Elliot looked over it one last time and whispered, "You taught me how to roast beans, Marco. Now let's burn the ones who tried to bury us." The meeting began with polite handshakes and false smiles. Calvin Stone entered Harbor Roast's executive lounge like a man returning to reclaim his kingdom. Sharply dressed, confident, carrying the quiet arrogance of someone who believed he held all the cards. He didn't recognize the silent nods between Elliot's legal team or the subtle camera tucked behind the conference room's coffee bar. He certainly didn't recognize the man across from him. Not until Elliot reached for the carafe of coffee and poured it with calm precision into 2 ceramic cups. "Cream?" Elliot asked, smiling coolly. Calvin blinked. The gesture was familiar, too familiar, and then recognition hit him like a freight train. "Elliot," he breathed. "Long time," Elliot replied, sliding the coffee across the table. "Thought I'd invite you back for one final roast." Calvin's mask cracked for a second, eyes darting, lips tight, but he recovered quickly. "So, what's this, a reunion? You finally decided to pay what I'm owed?" Elliot leaned back, hands folded. "I didn't bring you here to negotiate. I brought you here to listen." He tapped a button and the monitors flickered to life. On screen, spreadsheets, invoices, video clips, voice recordings. Calvin paled as he watched a delivery man speak into a phone. The handyman is still there. Then came audio of Calvin himself at the Whitestone rooftop, bragging about bleeding them slowly. Every lie laid bare, every threat is documented. "You wired the room?" Calvin growled. "Every room," Elliot replied. "We have enough evidence for federal fraud, corporate espionage, and wire fraud, and thanks to your ego, it's all admissible." The door opened behind them and 2 federal agents entered quietly. Calvin stood up sharply. "You can't do this," he snapped. "You have no idea what I gave to this company." Elliot rose slowly, facing him without anger. "You gave it heart, once, and then you tried to kill it." As the agents led Calvin out, Elliot's gaze didn't waver. "You said loyalty was a liability. I say it's what separates leaders from leeches." Later that afternoon, Elliot returned to Café 42, this time not as a visitor, but as the man who had seen the cracks and chose to patch them instead of paving over them. Marco was wiping down tables when he walked in, a relieved look spreading across his face. "It's over?" "It's beginning," Elliot said, handing him a folder. Inside, a new franchise agreement, retroactive bonuses, and a scholarship fund bearing Marco's name. "Your son's tuition is covered. And this cafe, it stays open as the new flagship." Marco stared in stunned silence. "You really mean it?" Elliot smiled and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Justice tastes better with a shot of cream." The following Saturday morning, the harbor shimmered under a pale gold sunrise as the first rays spilled across the windows of Café 42. Inside, the cafe buzzed with a quiet energy that felt different, lighter, almost reverent. Elliot stood behind the counter in a crisp white apron, a faded barista in training, pin clipped to his chest. Marco watched him from the prep table, arms crossed and half smiling. Didn't think I'd see the day the big boss would grind beans by hand, he teased. Elliot chuckled as he carefully poured boiling water over the grounds in a glass Chemex. Figured it was time I remembered what made this place special. Spoiler alert, it's not the quarterly reports. They worked side by side as the cafe opened, serving regulars who now recognized Elliot not as the CEO in suits from glossy magazine covers, but as the guy who knew how to steam milk without burning it. The register pinged steadily. A woman in scrubs grabbed her usual. A retired dock worker brought his grandkids for muffins, and a teenager nervously handed Marco a resume. It was the kind of morning that had once defined Harbor Roast. Small, warm, human. When Elliot stepped outside during a lull, he took a deep breath of salt and fresh bread in the air. It smelled like beginnings. Marco joined him with 2 cups, passing one over. Colombian blend. Same one you picked when you first opened this place. Thought it was too bold back then, he said. Elliot sipped and smiled. Guess I've grown into it. They stood in silence, watching the harbor, the world slowly waking up around them. You know, Marco said after a pause, I used to think legacy was about plaques and promotions, but it's not. It's about whether people remember your name when they walk into a place like this and smile. Elliot looked down into his coffee. I lost that for a while, he admitted. Got so focused on growth that I forgot what we were growing toward. He turned to Marco. But you didn't. You held the line. Marco shook his head. I just kept showing up, day after day. Exactly, Elliot said. That's what builds something real. Later that week, a bronze plaque was quietly mounted near the entrance of Café 42. It read, In honor of those who serve with heart, not just hands. Harbor Roast was built on their strength. Elliot didn't attend the ceremony. He was already visiting another struggling cafe, this time in Cleveland, asking questions, shaking hands, brewing coffee, not as a boss, as a student returning to the source. Because in the end, the right roast wasn't just about flavor. It was about remembering why you ever picked up the beans in the first place. The heart of this story lies in a powerful truth. Leadership isn't about titles or spreadsheets. It's about people. Elliot Ramsey, once a distant CEO, rediscovers that the foundation of his coffee empire wasn't built in boardrooms but behind cafe counters, by loyal employees like Marco, who quietly hold everything together. Through his undercover experience, Elliot confronts not just corporate corruption, but his own drift from the values that once defined him. The lesson is clear. Success means little if it comes at the cost of integrity, loyalty, and human connection. It takes humility to admit when you've lost your way, and even greater courage to make it right. By choosing to listen, to get his hands dirty, and to protect those being exploited, Elliot reclaims the soul of his company and sets a new standard for what real leadership looks like.